What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos, I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. Today specifically, we are going to be doing a compilation style video instead of a brand new case. It is two older cases that I have covered combined into one with a very small and very, spoiler alert, disappointing update that I'm going to be squeaking in at the end. Regardless of that though, if any of that sounds good to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. You're also, of course, invited to like and to comment and to hype the video if you feel so inclined. Of course, it's not required, but it's certainly appreciated. Either way, with all of the obligatory YouTube stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get into today's stories. Ooh, y'all, today is going to be one for the books. Today, I'm going to be covering my first wrongful conviction and exoneration case. At least I think that it's my first one. And actually, this is going to be a two-parter because there is just simply no way to cram all of the twists and turns and corruption and racial injustice that we're going to go over throughout this case into one video. So yeah, buckle the fuck up. This story is going to make your blood boil. At least I hope that it does. If it doesn't, you are probably in the wrong place and we are probably not each other's people. Today, we're going to be discussing the wrongful conviction of Lamont McIntyre, as well as the absolutely insidious corruption that was just festering within the law enforcement agency and the government personnel that are to blame for the 23 years he spent incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. Yeah, today is going to be a lot, as is next week. So today we are in Kansas City to be exact, and our story starts back in 1976 when Lamont McIntyre was born. Lamont McIntyre was born on July 28th, 1976 in Kansas City, Kansas to his mother, Rosie Lee McIntyre. He was one of 6 children, and although the family did definitely see their fair share of struggles, the one thing about them that never wavered was the fact that they were always incredibly close. The siblings all got along really well. They rarely ever fought. And because Rosie was a single parent who was working her ass off to support her 6 children, Lamont and his siblings really learned to lean on one another. Glacia, in particular, Lamont's older sister, she really took on a motherly role to her younger siblings whenever Rosie was off working. But it wasn't just Glacia stepping up to help. You know, they say it takes a village, and it certainly does sound like Rosie had her own little village to lean on. Whenever Lamont and his siblings weren't being looked over by their big sister, they were also seemingly always welcome over at their aunt's house to spend time with their cousins. And this tight-knit, always there for one another dynamic conditioned Lamont from a young age to really treasure and to value his family. His family was always a priority to him, and he always made sure to center basically everything he did around them. It really seems like Rosie tried her hardest to raise all of her children well. She taught them all to value family, to work hard, to praise God, and ironically, she taught them all to trust and respect the law. At the time our story really begins, at the front half of 1994, Lamont was just 17 years old. He was attending an alternative schooling program at the local Donnelly College. At the time, Donnelly offered a program for high school age students where they could attend classes at the college and work towards their GED. And then the big perk of the program was that once they did obtain their diplomas, Donnelly would then help transition them into college classes, which ideally would lead to their students graduating and obtaining college degrees. Then on top of his schooling, he also worked a couple of days a week at Fifi's Diner, sweeping floors for a little bit of extra spending money. Rosie also worked at Fifi's, which is likely why Lamont chose to work there. Like I said, the family was incredibly close and connected in basically every aspect of their lives. Now, there really isn't too terribly much available regarding Lamont's personal life throughout this time, but from what I could gather, aside from a few minor scrapes with authority, Lamont overall was a good kid. He was arrested twice prior to all of the shit we're going to get into in a few minutes. His first arrest was in December 1992 when he, his brother, and his cousin were implicated in the robbery of a Pizza Hut delivery driver. The three of them were all arrested, even though Lamont's cousin and brother both admitted to the robbery and both gave statements that Lamont was asleep on the couch inside and not even with them when the robbery occurred. But despite the fact that Lamont was not involved in this, an attorney for the boys ended up negotiating a plea deal where they would all avoid jail and simply be put on probation if they all pled guilty. Again, I cannot stress enough that Lamont was not involved in this robbery, but he was told that if he didn't plead guilty, that he'd likely end up getting convicted and that subsequently he'd end up serving a few years in prison. So given that he was 16 years old and scared, Lamont did as he was advised. He pled guilty, and as a result, as promised, he was let go on probation. Then his second arrest was in 1994. I'm not really 100% sure what the exact catalyst of all these events was, but what I do know is that in early 1994, for whatever reason, police approached Lamont and a small group of people that were hanging out outside of his cousin's house. And again, I don't know exactly what transpired, but one thing clearly led to another. And after finding drugs on a few of the people involved, including Lamont, he was arrested again. And sure, objectively, I understand that being wrapped up in these things wasn't great. It doesn't change the fact that, as far as I could find, Lamont was never violent, he wasn't a danger to the community, and I can't find anything that would lead me to believe that he ever showed any signs of even having the potential desire to hurt anyone. Yeah, maybe he got wrapped up in some not so great things. Yeah, maybe he dabbled in drugs and maybe he even skipped school every now and then. But for the most part, Lamont was just a normal teen living in an impoverished, high-crime area, doing his best to get by. A lot of the things that he was involved with really weren't even his fault. It was just the culture of the area that he lived in. And that, my friends, brings us to April 15th, 1994. The day started out relatively normal for Lamont. He'd spent the night before at his aunt's house hanging out with his cousins. Obviously, he'd then woken up at his aunt's place that day, and for reasons that are unknown to me, he decided to skip school that day. A decision that I have to imagine haunts him to this very day. But since he was not going to go to school that day, one of the first things he did do was he ran out to the store to pick up some bread for his aunt so that she could make breakfast for everyone. And then aside from that, according to everyone that was there, Lamont only left the house one other time that day when he ran home to help his mom with something. And even then, he wasn't gone for that long. He didn't even change his clothes when he went home. That's how quick the trip was. And that may seem completely pointless for me to mention, but I assure you, it's not. Lamont and his cousins actually explicitly remember what he was wearing that day because it was actually an ongoing joke between all of them. His cousins teased him all day about the fact that he hadn't brought any extra clothes over to his aunt's house with him, even though he'd gone over with the intent to spend the night. So he'd gotten there the day before wearing a black shirt with white writing, khaki pants, and a hat. And the next day, while he was at his aunt's house watching TV and movies with his cousins, Lamont was wearing the same outfit. And that was basically his day. He woke up, he went to the store for bread, and then he hung out at his aunt's house. And now knowing what his day consisted of, you can likely understand that he was a little taken aback when his grandma called his aunt's house looking for him that evening. He picked up the phone and he was very surprised to learn that evidently police were out looking for him. Obviously, that's not great news for anyone, but hearing this, Lamont actually really wasn't all that concerned at first. As previously mentioned, he'd been recently busted for drug possession. So when he heard police were looking for him, he was like, oh shit, I was probably supposed to be in court today and I missed it. That was all he thought it was, just a simple misunderstanding. So, trying to be responsible, Lamont actually ended up calling Rosie and asking her if there was any way that she could leave work, come and pick him up, and run him to the police station. Obviously, she agrees to. She goes, she picks him up from his aunt's house, and the two of them are on their way to the police station when they pass by Fifi's diner. Again, the diner that Rosie and Lamont both worked at. They drive past and they just so happen to realize that in the parking lot, there are some cop cars gathered and some officers hanging out. So Rosie calls an audible. She swings into the diner parking lot and she flags down these officers, hoping that maybe they can explain what's going on with her son. Remember, at this point, they're operating under the assumption that this is all probably just one big misunderstanding regarding a missed court date. Rosie had absolutely no qualms pulling over to talk to this group of officers. She had no reason to believe that after that conversation, she and her son's lives would never be the same. From the moment she introduced herself to the cops, told them who she was and who her son was, the entire trajectory of their lives changed forever. Now, at first, Rosie's interaction with the cops seemed average enough. They still didn't really tell her exactly what was going on, but they did tell her that yes, they'd been looking for Lamont, that it wasn't for anything serious, and that all they would need was 15 minutes of his time. She was assured that one 15-minute discussion with Lamont down at the station would clear everything up. However, that was far from the truth. Instead, the next thing Rosie saw was her son, her precious little boy, being escorted away in handcuffs. It went from, we just need 15 minutes, to Lamont being detained and hauled off to the police station by the officers on the scene. And I'll tell you what, to hear Rosie recount this experience as a mother, it is absolutely gut-wrenching. Years later, she told the Kansas City Star, quote, "I believed in the system. They said, give them 15 minutes, and I did. And I never got my son back." And for the next almost quarter of a century, Rosie's contact with her son would be limited solely to what the state of Kansas deemed permissible. And at this point, much like Rosie and Lamont, you are probably wondering what on earth is going on? Why was Lamont arrested? Well, to answer that question, we have to jump back a few hours to right around 2 p.m. that same day, April 15th, 1994. It was a warm spring day, one of the first really warm days of the season, and about a mile and a half away from Lamont's house, two young men sat parked on a residential street, completely oblivious to the fact that within the next few minutes, their lives would be over. 21-year-old Donnell Quinn and 34-year-old Donald Ewing sat idling in a powder blue Cadillac DeVille parked right across the street from 3032 Hutchings Street. I don't know exactly what their plans were for the day. I don't know exactly what they were doing, but according to Hutchings Street resident Nico Quinn, who I'm sure you noticed the familiar last name, was in fact Donnell or Little Don's cousin. And to hear her describe it, it wasn't uncommon for people to sit in parked cars on the street, either to just hang out and talk. Maybe they were waiting for someone to come and meet up with them, or sometimes people would park to participate in drug-related activities. Again, I have absolutely no clue specifically what Little Don and Donald, who by the way went by Donnie, no clue what they were doing. I wasn't there. I've seen reports that they were doing drugs in the car, but it really does not matter. Whatever they were doing, the men were completely unsuspecting as another man, dressed in all black, made his way down a hill and through a vacant lot that sat across the street from 3032 Hutchings. The lot had once held a rundown old house, but by this point, and even to this day, all that lie between Hutchings and Hiawatha Street, which ran parallel to Hutchings, was an empty lot and some broken concrete steps. The man seemed to move with purpose through the overgrown weeds that now covered the vacant lot before he approached the Cadillac, which he did with little to no hesitation. And once he reached the car, he raised the 12-gauge shotgun he'd been carrying, aimed it into the vehicle, and one right after the other, he fired 4 rounds into Donnie and Little Don. Then, just as nonchalantly as he'd approached the vehicle, he turned and he walked away, headed back through the lot and up the hill, up to Hiawatha Street, where he'd initially been dropped off. The shooter then simply got back in his vehicle and drove away. And what's crazy is not only how brazenly this person committed this murder, shooting 2 men in the middle of broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, but it's that he just seemed so calm and so unbothered by the whole experience. Meanwhile, back on Hutchings Street, total and complete chaos broke out. Coincidentally, just before the shooting had taken place, Little Don's father, John Quinn, had actually driven past the Cadillac that his son and Donnie were in. He'd driven past, and he hadn't made it more than a few yards past them when he heard the shots ring out. And immediately upon hearing those booming gunshots, John whipped his car back around and drove back to the Cadillac, which was actually slightly further away from his car than it had initially been, because following the gunshot, the Cadillac actually rolled back, I think like 30 feet. Nevertheless, though, John made his way back to his son, hoping to help him, just hoping that he was still alive. Now, if I'm being honest, this next part kind of confused me a little bit, but it's how it's reported. So evidently, when John got to the car, despite the fact that Donnie, who'd been in the driver's seat, and little Don, who'd been in the passenger seat, had been shot through the window of the car, it's reported by multiple sources that John actually had to break the car's window in order to unlock the car to get to his son. So I don't know if part of the pane of glass was still hanging on and he had to break out the remainder to reach the lock, or what, but from my understanding, the shooter had shot through the passenger window, which was the side that little Don was on. So it's very confusing to me that after 4 shotgun blasts, there would still be any window left. But like I said, it's reported from multiple sources that he had to break the window to get to little Don. So yeah, he breaks the window, and as he's trying to render aid to his son, little Don's Aunt Josephine and cousin Stacy, hearing the shots, had also run out to the vehicle. I cannot even begin to imagine how traumatic it must have been for so many of little Don's family members to see him like this, for his dad to see him like this, for his aunt to see him like this. And evidently, when Stacy saw that it was her cousin that had been on the receiving end of some of those gunshots, she just began hysterically screaming that it was little Don and that little Don had been shot. And what's even more chilling than that is that at this point, Donnie, he was still alive. He was still alive, and he too was screaming, I don't know why they did this. We didn't do anything. And that just, it gives me chills. I cannot even begin to imagine how scary this was for him, to know that very likely he was not going to survive this. Nico Quinn, who again was little Don's cousin, so sister to Stacy and other daughter to Josephine, she had been at her mom's house at the time the shooting took place, and she recalls running to the car only to see that it was her little cousin, whom, mind you, she was extremely close to, that had been on the receiving end of some of those gunshots. Specifically, she recalls, and this is graphic, so I apologize in advance, but she vividly remembers looking in the car and seeing her cousin, who honestly was more like a brother to her, laid back with half his face gone. Honestly, I cannot imagine anything more horrific. Truly, Nico and everyone that was there that day must be so haunted and so traumatized by the things they saw. I don't know how someone would ever get over something like that. And while the last thing I ever want to do is interrupt the flow of the story, I know that I just threw a lot of names and people and relationships at you. So just for clarification purposes, Donald and Donnell had been parked on Hutchings Street across from Donnell's Aunt Josephine's house, 3032 Hutchings, where Josephine lived with her daughter Stacy. Then next to Josephine's house at 3020 Hutchings lived a woman named Ruby Mitchell, whom we'll get into more shortly. And then directly next to Ruby Mitchell's house at 3018 Hutchings was Nico's house. And Nico was Stacy's sister and Josephine's other daughter and also Donnell's cousin. And it was purely by happenstance that Donnell's father, John, had been driving past the scene where just moments later, his son would be murdered. Hopefully that kind of clears things up and makes things slightly less confusing because, again, I know it's a lot. Especially if you throw in the fact that I've also seen Nico described as a distant cousin of Donald's. So I have to deduce that even if they weren't all related, they were all very close and all knew each other very well. I mean, this would be horrific to witness if it happened to complete strangers. So the fact that basically all of the first people on the scene were close friends and relatives of the victims, it makes me sick to my stomach. I cannot imagine being in that position. Like, what do you even do? Obviously, they called 911, but beyond that, what do you do? From the reports I read, it seems like poor Josephine was praying over her nephew, just praying for a miracle, praying for his life. But sadly, as paramedics finally arrived and pulled him out of the car, it became undeniably clear to everyone there that little Don was gone. Donald, however, was still miraculously clinging to his life. He was rushed to Bethany Medical Center, which is located about 3 miles away from where the shooting took place. However, despite surviving the initial shooting, Donald did ultimately succumb to his injuries, passing away later that same evening. And with Donald's passing, police were now officially investigating a double homicide. Luckily for them, and I say luckily because clearly nothing is lucky about this situation, and it's only going to get worse from here, but from an investigation standpoint, you would think it'd be beneficial for them that the crime had taken place in the middle of broad daylight in front of a slew of witnesses. Ruby Mitchell, whom, if you'll remember, lived just down the street from where the shootings took place, she was actually interviewed by police fairly quickly. She told police that she'd been standing at her front door when she saw a man dressed in a black shirt and black pants come down the hill and fire 4 shots into the Cadillac. Ruby had actually been one of the first residents of Hutchings Street to call the police after the shooting. When asked by police if she'd gotten a good look at the shooter, Ruby told detectives that she had, and that if she were to see him again, she could easily identify him. Actually, the guy had looked kind of familiar to Ruby, which was huge. She was immediately taken down to the police station by the lead investigator on the case, Detective Roger Galupski, and Galupski wanted Ruby to help a sketch artist put together a composite sketch of the alleged shooter, as well as he also wanted her to provide an official recorded statement. So once Ruby had finished speaking with the sketch artist, she began one of, I believe, 2 separate, broken up statements. All in all, I think she ended up being at the station for 4 or 5 hours that evening, and evidently it just so happened to be sometime in between these 2 recordings that apparently it dawned on Ruby who the alleged shooter was and why he looked so familiar to her. So right around 6 p.m., about 3-ish hours after she'd been taken to the station, the second recording begins, and police ask her to repeat on the record what she'd said after the first recording had stopped. And this is when Ruby explains to police, I guess for the second time, that she believed she'd recognized the shooter as a young man named Lamont, who used to try and talk to her niece. Ruby was then shown a photo lineup which contained the photos of 5 different young men, and she was asked to identify which of the men, if any, resembled the shooter. And inexplicably, Ruby selected Lamont. Our Lamont. Lamont McIntyre. For some reason, Ruby selected his photo out of the lineup, despite the fact that he looked absolutely nothing like the composite sketch she'd just helped create, and despite the fact that Lamont's hair looked absolutely nothing like the short hair or braids that she had claimed the shooter had been sporting. But when asked if she was absolutely sure if the photo she'd picked out, Lamont's photo, if that was the man she'd seen shoot Donnie and Little Dawn, she maintained that it was. Police asked her how she knew him. She again said that he used to talk to her niece. They asked her how long she'd known him. She claimed that she'd known him for a few months. And most damning, when they asked her what his name was, she gave them his name correctly. She answered that his name was Lamont McIntyre. And while she was correct that her niece had at one point talked to a man named Lamont, it would turn out that that Lamont was neither our Lamont nor was he the shooter. The man Ruby was thinking of was a completely unrelated man named Lamont Drain. And even though Ruby would later try to recant her identification of Lamont McIntyre, it was simply too late. As soon as Ruby pointed his picture out in the photo lineup that day, police were out for blood. They didn't even bother following up with Nico Quinn, Little Don's cousin, who'd also witnessed the shooting that day. She spoke to police at the scene, and she told them that she had gotten a good look at the shooter and that she would be able to recognize him if she saw him again. But for some reason, police saw no benefit to bringing her to the station that day and showing her the same photo lineup that they'd showed Ruby. Nope, they didn't speak with Nico or her mother Josephine, who also was a witness, until the following day. And by then, they already had Lamont in custody. But for now, they piled in their cruisers, they left the station, and they hit the Kansas City streets in search of Lamont. They rolled up however many officers deep up to Lamont's grandma's house. Her name's Maxine. They rolled up to her house. She's just sitting on her front porch, enjoying the weather, minding her business, when all of a sudden the Kansas City Police Brigade pull up and start asking her where her grandson is. They wouldn't tell her why they wanted to speak with him, not even a vague statement that could allude to any context. They basically just pulled up and asked her to help them find him. Sorry, there was simply no way I was doing that liner on camera. Doesn't matter, back to the story. So Maxine's confused, rightfully so. She doesn't know what to do, so she first ended up calling Rosie to tell her that she needed to find Lamont and to take him down to the station to clear up whatever was going on. And then I guess it was after that phone call that Maxine called her other daughter, so Lamont's aunt, the one whose house he was at, and that's when she ended up telling him what was going on and that the cops were out looking for him and that he needed to get in touch with his mom so that together they could go down and work all this out. And that kind of brings us full circle back to the beginning of the story when Lamont was unexpectedly apprehended by police at Fifi's diner, following his mom pulling over to find out exactly what was going on. So Lamont was arrested. He was hauled off down to the police station, and upon his arrival, he was placed in an interrogation room where he was soon joined by Roger Galupski. And Galupski, as you would expect, ran Lamont through the interrogation gambit. Where was he that day? Did he know the victims? Was he involved in any gang activity? Had he ever seen the blue Cadillac? Etc., etc. And Lamont, who was realizing that this most certainly was not all about a missed court date, vehemently denied being involved with any gangs, and he maintained that he'd been with his family all day. Even when Galupski lied to Lamont and told him that Donnie had identified him as the shooter in the hospital prior to his death, Lamont maintained his innocence. He told Galupski that, with all due respect, which later we'll find out is absolutely none, but Lamont respectfully told Detective Galupski that he was wrong, that he had been nowhere near the crime scene that day, that he hadn't shot anyone, and that he was innocent. Even when Lamont told Galupski that he could speak to his aunt and speak to his cousins, that they would corroborate his alibi, he was ignored. Galupski didn't even take down any of Lamont's family members' names. He truly made absolutely no effort to verify or even refute Lamont's alibi. It was as if he'd just decided it wasn't true, and that was good enough. Lamont's family even came down on their own accord without being called in for statements. They came in on their own volition to provide their statements and to try to tell police that Lamont could not have been the shooter. But no matter how hard anyone tried, Lamont's cries of innocence fell on deaf ears. Lamont's questioning was brief, it was traumatic, and worst of all, it was completely unproductive. Once Galupski was finished with him, he was booked into the jail. And ultimately, Lamont McIntyre would be charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was 17 years old, he was scared, he was confused, and above all else, he was innocent. Lamont's grandmother, Maxine Crowder, when speaking about Kansas City, once stated, quote, "It's a place where nothing goes right and where there is no hope." And sadly, that quote perfectly captures the essence of Lamont's case. The day after the shooting, so April 16th, Detective Galupski returned to Hutchings Street to see what the other eyewitnesses from the previous day could determine based on the photo lineup. When shown said lineup, Josephine told Galupski that she couldn't make an identification because although she had seen the incident play out, she hadn't been close enough to get a good look at the shooter. Josephine did make sure to mention to Galupski, though, that her daughter Stacy had seen the shooting and that she had gotten a good look at the shooter. However, Galupski never followed up on this. Nico, on the other hand, was there the day that Galupski returned to Hutchings Street, just toting around his little photo lineup. And according to Galupski's official report, when shown the lineup, Nico repeatedly and for a prolonged period of time viewed photo number 3. Lamont's photo. She clutched the photo, began shaking, and became teary-eyed, and according to Galupski, she was still visibly traumatized by what she'd seen. He claims that he asked her numerous times if the suspect in photo number 3 was the person she'd seen shoot her cousin, but she was apparently too shaken up and too fearful to definitively pick an individual. Although she, like I said, seemed to not want to put down Lamont's photo. Finally, Galupski took the photo from her, and he asked her directly if Lamont had been the shooter, to which she responded by placing her head on the table and stating that she thought it was him, but that she couldn't be totally sure. She then apparently became so emotional that they had to end their interview right then and there. And actually, with that, I'm going to end the first half of this video. I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, Lamont goes to court. Don't go nowhere. All right, so 2 months after his arrest, Lamont attended a hearing in juvenile court in June that served not only to determine whether he should be tried as an adult, but it was also just a general preliminary hearing. Inexplicably, at this hearing, Nico Quinn and Ruby Mitchell both appeared and both made in-person identifications of Lamont. And this ultimately led the judge to determine that due to the eyewitness identifications, enough probable cause existed for Lamont to be tried as an adult. Therefore, he would be. Lamont was provided a court-appointed attorney, one Mr. Gary W. Long II, and with all due respect to Mr. Long, this basically set Lamont up for failure from the start. Well, that and deep-rooted systemic corruption, but we'll get into that. As for Gary Long, to put it lightly, he wasn't the best attorney. Just 2 weeks after Lamont's preliminary hearing, Gare Bear was put on 2 years of supervised probation for failing to properly represent clients in 3 separate federal cases. So not exactly who I'd want representing me for anything, but especially not for a double homicide. Yikes. It's also worth mentioning that Gary ended up receiving 4 additional complaints against him between the initial 3 and 1998, finding himself in such hot water that he ultimately ended up relinquishing his license to practice law and being disbarred. That said, close to 20 years later, he did retake and repass the bar exam. He was relicensed and permitted to begin practicing law again, so here's hoping that he's honed his craft a little since the 90s. I will say, though, that despite being seemingly terrible at his job, Gary Long always, quote, had a strong feeling that Lamont was innocent, especially given the fact that when offered a plea agreement, Lamont refused to take it. He vehemently refused to plead guilty to a crime that he simply did not commit, which it is just so crazy that he was so trusting in the system. So sure that if he took his case to trial, that truth and justice would prevail and that he would be found innocent. And then when you think about what actually ends up happening, it is very scary. Lamont went to trial in September 1994. As previously mentioned, he was tried as an adult, and he was tried for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case was prosecuted by Wyandotte County Assistant District Attorney Tara Moorhead, who, in her opening statement, told the jury that, quote, numerous reliable sources had indicated that the individual who was responsible for this was the defendant, Lamont McIntyre. Despite the fact that there was no easily discernible motive for the murders, nor was there any definitively determined connection between Lamont and the victims, ADA Moorhead still painted a picture to the jury that Lamont had murdered Donnie and Little Don because he had a vendetta against them. Galupski testified that he'd spoken to various sources, all of whom had implicated Lamont in the murder. However, only 2 out of the various sources would be called to the stand to testify, Ruby Mitchell and Nico Quinn. I believe Ruby testified first, telling the court that she had in fact picked Lamont out of a photo lineup. However, she asserted at the time that she didn't know his name, which is very confusing when you consider that when the police had her make her recorded identification, magically, she knew his full name, first and last, which would have been a great point for the defense to make, but frustratingly, Gary Long made absolutely no mention of this inconsistency. As for Nico's testimony, she told the court that initially she could not identify any of the photos in the lineup, but that later, during her second meeting with Galupski, which, by the way, took place in his car, that was when she determined, during that second conversation, that Lamont was the man who'd shot her cousin. There were a number of inconsistencies between Nico's testimony at the preliminary hearing and her testimony at trial, but because Gary Long wasn't able to obtain or present a copy of the preliminary hearing testimony during the trial, ADA Moorhead argued that he should not be allowed to question her on said inconsistencies. And the judge agreed. ADA Moorhead got her way, and Gary Long was barred from questioning Nico regarding her testimony at the preliminary hearing. And this really hurt Lamont's case, obviously, as did Gary Long's lackluster defense. He did the bare minimum at best. He didn't capitalize on the lack of evidence supporting his client's alleged guilt. He didn't request any sort of examination of the recovered shotgun shells that had been ejected during the shooting. didn't request fingerprints, nothing. He never requested forensic examination of Lamont's clothing from April 15th, which, given the eyewitness accounts of the shooting and how close the shooter had been to the vehicle when the shots were fired, likely, had he been the shooter, would have had glass and blood on them. He never looked into reconstructing the crime scene in order to determine the validity of the eyewitness statements. Specifically, I think it was later determined that it was doubtful that Ruby Mitchell could have actually clearly seen the killer's face from her screen front door. Nope, he didn't do any of that. Instead, Gary never even bothered to interview Ruby or Nico prior to the trial. And no one interviewed Stacy Quinn, whom everybody knew had clearly seen the shooting. Basically, all Gary presented at trial in Lamont's defense was his alibi. He called multiple members of Lamont's family to the stand to testify, and each and every one of them, under oath and the threat of perjury, testified that Lamont was at least a mile away from where the double homicide he sat accused of took place. From my understanding, each of Lamont's family members gave basically an identical story. However, ADA Moorhead argued to the court that the defense's witnesses were unreliable, that they couldn't keep their stories straight. And to substantiate that argument, ADA Moorhead ended up calling Galupski to the stand, where he testified that Lamont's mom, Rosie, had told him that her and Lamont had been at Fifi's diner all day on April 15th. And if she had told him this, obviously that would contradict the other family member statements that Lamont had been at his aunt's house with them all day. I don't know if Rosie ever actually told Galupski this. I'm inclined to believe that she didn't, because as we'll get into later, Galupski is an absolutely massive piece of human garbage. But whether she said it or not, at the time, Galupski was a respected officer of the law. Therefore, his testimony and story that Rosie had lied to protect her son held a significant amount of weight in the eyes of the jury. Even more weight than the fact that they never found a murder weapon, nor did they ever search Lamont's house for one. Seriously, when I tell you that they had absolutely nothing against this boy, I mean it. They tried him on nothing but a hope and a prayer. Closing arguments concluded on September 28th, 1994, just 3 days into the trial, with ADA Moorhead leaving the jury with a reminder that Lamont had killed Donnie and Little Don in order to settle a score that he had with them. What score? Who knows? She never elaborated. She just reminded the jury that Lamont had a vendetta against these men and that he had murdered them to settle a score. Once the defense presented their closing arguments, the jury was dismissed for deliberation. They deliberated for the rest of the day and into the morning of the following day before they ultimately came back with a decision. And on September 29th, 1994, Lamont McIntyre, who was just freshly 18, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, found guilty of a double homicide that he did not commit. He was convicted despite the fact that there was no physical, no forensic, or really not even any circumstantial evidence to bolster the allegations. The jury still found Lamont guilty, and subsequently he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. When given the opportunity to address the court, Lamont simply stated, quote, "Judge, I would like to tell the court that I'm innocent. That's all." And then he was whisked away to Lansing State Penitentiary, where he would spend the next 23 years of his life. Obviously, he should not have been convicted. I mean, he shouldn't have been charged in the first place. He shouldn't have been charged. He shouldn't have been convicted. But when I tell you the fact that it took over 2 decades to right this wrong is absolutely unbelievable, just wow. First of all, the jury's decision to convict in the first place was actually not one that came easy to 2 of the jurors, the final 2 holdouts. And one of these juries, Greg Lauber, when later asked about his decision to convict Lamont, Greg told Jim McCluskey of Centurion Ministries, the nonprofit that helped exonerate Lamont, that the verdict had never sat right with him, that he'd always had his doubts regarding Lamont's guilt. He was so bothered by the conviction, actually, that a couple of months after the trial, he called ADA Moorhead and he asked her if she thought that the jurors had done the right thing. This decision was eating him alive. And in response, she told him to rest easy. She assured him that there was a ton of evidence that she hadn't been able to present at trial, and that if he knew what she knew, he would be confident in his decision. Spoiler alert, there was no additional evidence to support that Lamont had committed these murders. There was, however, a lot of stuff that started coming up that went against the idea that Lamont was guilty, starting with a statement made by Stacy Quinn. Stacy, whom, if you'll remember, is Nico's sister, had been directly across the street at her mother's house when the shooting had taken place. And following Lamont's conviction and sentencing, Stacy came forward stating that she had never been contacted by police. She had also never been called to testify, despite the fact that police were told by multiple people that Stacy could identify the suspect. She stated that she had clearly witnessed the shooting and that there was not a doubt in her mind that Lamont McIntyre was not the shooter. Unfortunately, though, Stacy's statement was deemed to be unreliable because she was a drug user and she failed to come forward earlier. And sadly, Stacy Quinn herself would be murdered in 2000. So she never got to see Lamont be freed. She never got to see the corruption within Kansas City's law enforcement be addressed. And of course, most devastatingly, she never got to see her 7 children grow up. Now, I'm going to go more in depth into a lot with Stacy in next week's video. Like I said, this week's video is part 1. This week, I wanted to focus on Lamont, but next week, I fully intend to focus on this meatloaf with a mustache. So please know that I am fully aware of the absolutely heinous atrocities Roger Galupski is accused of. Please don't think I'm glossing over them or that I'm not doing them justice. Rather, that is going to get its own in-depth deep dive next week. That way I can give Galupski's alleged victims the dedicated time they deserve as well, without taking away from Lamont. Which, getting back to Lamont, Stacy was not the only person to come forward following his conviction to try and set the record straight. Nico also came forward and recanted her identification of Lamont. And what's absolutely bananas is that this wasn't her first time trying to do so. Nico claims that she actually told ADA Moorhead twice prior to Lamont's trial that she did not believe that he was actually the shooter. Wait, so why did she testify, you may be wondering? Well, that would be because ADA Moorhead allegedly told her that unless she testified and stuck to her initial story that Lamont had been the shooter, that she, ADA Moorhead, would make sure that she, Nico, was arrested and that the state took her children away. Tara baby, we call that tampering with a witness, and it's a big no-no. It should go without saying that ADA Moorhead also never informed Gary Long, Lamont's defense attorney, about Nico's attempt to recant her identification. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't that be a Brady violation, allegedly? Yikes. Following their statements, both Stacy and Nico signed sworn affidavits in which they both asserted that Lamont could not have been the person that they saw shoot Donnie and little Don. According to the Quinn sisters, Lamont was too tall, his face was too long, and his ears stuck out too much to be the person they saw. Following Lamont's conviction, Rosie ended up hiring a new legal team to handle her son's defense. I can't imagine why. And in light of Nico and Stacy's affidavits, Lamont's attorneys immediately filed a direct appeal of his conviction and a motion for a new trial. The case was heard in 1996 by one Judge Dexter Burdett, who ultimately declined to grant Lamont a new trial because, in his opinion, Stacy Quinn was an unreliable habitual felon and Nico had no credibility whatsoever, stating, quote, "I find no credibility whatsoever in her recantation. I find it incredible, frankly, and in effect not believable that someone watched their relatives be murdered and did not say anything at all about who the perpetrator was until now." Bro, she tried to say something and your ADA threatened her into keeping up a lie to strengthen her case. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say your ADA? I meant your ex-girlfriend. Yeah. It came out like 10 years later that Judge Burdett and ADA Moorhead had been bumping uglies about 3 years prior to Lamont's trial. And while they were no longer romantically involved in 96 when Burdett oversaw the hearing for Lamont's new trial, you can't tell me that the simple fact of those two being in a damn courtroom together after plowing for however long isn't a massive conflict of interest. No, like you really can't tell me it's not, because a Yale Law School professor / expert in legal ethics reviewed the case and ultimately ended up concluding that Burdett and Moorhead had engaged in misconduct by not disclosing their relationship. He referred to the misconduct as a miscarriage of justice, stating, quote, "The concealed relationship obliterated any semblance of judicial impartiality in Mr. McIntyre's trial. It infected every aspect of these proceedings with implicit bias. As a result, Mr. McIntyre was denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. It is impossible to believe that Judge Burdett's favoritism towards Miss Moorhead did not influence the numerous rulings that were made that were adverse to Mr. McIntyre, both during his trial and during the post-conviction proceedings, even in ways that Judge Burdett could not recognize. Like I said, this relationship didn't come to light until the early 2000s, but it definitely did ultimately help to strengthen the argument that Lamont deserved, at the very least, a new trial. Sadly, though, Lamont wouldn't see vindication for another decade, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself, so back to 1997. Following his conviction, Lamont quickly exhausted all his appeals, leaving one of the few options he had left being to file a post-conviction motion contending that he had been denied his right to a fair trial. Representing Lamont this time around was attorney Mark Sash, and if you're hoping that this time he got a good one, I don't want to burst your bubble, but prior to presenting this case to Judge Burdett, yes, Judge Burdett again, but before this portion of the case even ended up in front of him in October 1997, Josephine Quinn actually sat down and met with Mark Sash. The two had what seemed to Josephine like a very compelling conversation in which she explained that at one point, she had spoken to Tara Moorhead and told her that Lamont was not the shooter. And while she hadn't gotten a good enough look at the shooter necessarily to identify him, she had gotten a good enough look at him to know that it was not Lamont. In her opinion, Lamont was much taller than the shooter. He had bigger lips than the shooter, and his complexion was different than the shooter's had been. But in true Moorhead fashion, she dismissed Josephine's statements and instead told her that it was too late. The jury was already deliberating, and there was just nothing more that could be done. And this whole revelation from Josephine, it sounds great, right? When it came time for Sash to present his case at the hearing, which had gotten pushed back and ended up taking place on January 16th, 1998, he showed up without witnesses, without evidence, and without Lamont. Furthermore, Sash never even bothered to speak to Lamont prior to this hearing. And finally, he also failed not only to call Josephine to testify, but he didn't even bother to introduce the affidavit he'd helped her complete a mere 2 months earlier. Now, if his job had been merely to show up, he nailed it. But considering his job was actually to present a compelling argument in Lamont's favor, to put it lightly, he missed the mark. And what's ironic is that much like Gary Long, Sash voluntarily relinquished his license and was disbarred in 2007. I guess he didn't think that the nearly 20 disciplinary proceedings pending against him were worth it. Seemed hard. Unfortunately, though, he was still practicing law in 98 when he absolutely crapped the bed on Lamont's post-conviction motion. Judge Burdett ended up ruling against Lamont, stating, quote, "I have gone over this particular trial and the efforts of both sides many times, and I'm convinced the defendant got a fair trial." The fact that Lamont had so much trust and so much faith in the justice system that he genuinely believed that he'd be walking out of the courtroom back in 94 a free man, and that justice system not only let him down, but consistently failed him at every turn for decades, I cannot even imagine. Rightfully so, Lamont spent his first few years in lockup, for lack of a better term, pissed the off. He was so angry that he spent the first 5 years in, quote, a trance or shock or something. He barely talked. He never smiled. In fact, he looked so angry all the time and had such a stone face that he was very quickly given the nickname Muggs by his fellow inmates. But no matter how angry he got, Lamont always tried to stay true to who he was. He knew he was innocent. He knew he wasn't the cold-blooded killer that he'd been labeled as. So no matter how mad he got, he never lashed out at anyone. He just minded his own business. And he carried that hurt and anger with him, like I said, for 5 years before a friend of his in prison was able to help him gain kind of a new perspective on things. Not only did this man help to restore Lamont's faith in God, but he also helped him realize that the baggage he was carrying, the anger he'd been toting around, it wasn't hurting anyone other than him. The only person he was affecting with his anger was himself. The people who'd put him in prison, they were sleeping perfectly fine at night. And this revelation, well, it changed Lamont's entire attitude. Instead of spending his days stewing in anger, he now spent them praying, talking on the phone with his family, working out, watching the news, reading. But a majority of his free time was spent writing hundreds of letters a week to different organizations and media outlets that he hoped might be able to help him. People like Oprah. And while Lamont actually did receive a decent amount of letters back in response to his, most of them, sadly, were to thank him for writing and to regretfully inform him that they couldn't help him. That is until 2001, when Lamont wrote a letter to Jim McCluskey, the founder of Centurion Ministries. I briefly touched on this before, but Centurion is a nonprofit organization located in Princeton, New Jersey, and their mission is to exonerate innocent individuals who have been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to either life in prison or to death. They also continue to support their exonerees after they've been released from prison as they try to reintegrate back into society. Since Jim founded the organization in 1983, Centurion has helped to secure exonerations for 70 men and women who were serving life or death sentences for crimes they didn't commit. And this is why I am not really a big fan of the death penalty. I just think there is way too big of a margin for error. That's not the point of this video, obviously. It's just absolutely ass bananas to me how many people are probably sitting in prison or on death row, or even worse, how many people may have already died, whether due to natural causes while in prison or being put to death, all for crimes they didn't commit. That should scare every single one of us. It is so fucking scary. At any rate, in Lamont's letter to Centurion, he explained that he was 100% innocent of the crimes he was doing time for. He wrote that despite his best efforts to try and prove his innocence, no one believed him. And by the time he was writing them, he explained that he had no money and no idea where to go next. However, he promised them that if they just took one look into his case, they would see that he should not be in prison. They would plainly and easily see that he was innocent. Lamont and Jim spoke back and forth to one another via letters for 8 years before Centurion formally took on Lamont's case. And even though I'm fairly certain that Jim was convinced of Lamont's innocence well before that, according to Centurion's website, it takes on average 8 to 10 years and $350,000 to free an innocent person. So while, yes, that sounds like a long time, you have to remember that this is an extensive process that requires hiring investigators, attorneys, crime specialists. A variety of different experts are needed for this. It is a massive uphill battle clearing someone's name, and Lamont's situation was absolutely no exception. McCluskey basically had to rebuild the investigation surrounding Lamont from the ground up. He went to Kansas City, he went to the scene of the shooting, he spoke to the Quinn family, he spoke to Lamont's family, he spoke to Ruby Mitchell, and with each and every person he spoke to, and each and every new piece of information he received, Jim McCluskey became more and more convinced of what I'm pretty sure he knew deep down since the beginning. Lamont McIntyre was innocent. Once he felt he had a solid case for Lamont's innocence, Jim hired an attorney to try and get the case back in court. He presented everything he'd found over the course of his investigation, everything we've discussed here so far today. But despite how compelling the argument was, the attorney did not seem to give a tiny rat's ass about anything he said or any evidence he presented. It was like no matter what they did, they were stuck. That is, until Centurion presented Lamont's case to attorney Cheryl Pilati. Cheryl is a law partner at Morgan Pilati LLC. She focuses her practice on vindicating the individual rights and liberties of her clients, and she is widely known for her exoneration of clients in actual innocence cases. Cases where criminal justice has critically failed at trial and through the appellate phases. Cheryl believes in the law, she believed in Centurion, and most importantly to this case, she believed in Lamont. Together with retired police detective Mark Bussell, Cheryl teamed up with the Midwest Innocence Project, and the group spent years uncovering substantial evidence that effectively dismantled the state's case against Lamont, just board by board. With the information they gathered, Cheryl put together a document that, all in all, ended up being more than 100 pages long, detailing how each and every piece of evidence against Lamont had either been disproven or recanted. Her report highlighted how ADA Moorhead failed to disclose potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense, how ADA Moorhead elicited false testimony from witnesses. She presented her reconstruction of the crime scene, which showed that Ruby Mitchell would not have been able to see the gunman's face from where she claimed to be standing when the murders occurred. She presented new testimony from several witnesses who claimed that the murders were committed by a man known as Monster, who worked as an enforcer for a local drug kingpin, and she outlined the misconduct committed by ADA Moorhead and Judge Burdett when they failed to disclose their history of doing the old no pants stance. Cheryl outlined these injustices as well as many, many more in her 100-page document, and she included over 40 sworn affidavits from different witnesses that helped to support each and every point in her argument. Her argument that the police and prosecution not only consistently subverted and concealed the truth, but that they also manufactured evidence and presented testimony that they knew to be false. And serendipitously, by the time this motion was filed, Kansas City had actually elected a new district attorney, 34-year-old Mark Dupree. Dupree actually knew Lamont's case fairly well. He'd even looked into it himself briefly. So when he sat down with Cheryl and Jim in 2017, he took less convincing than they likely expected to approve the motion and to set a date for an exoneration hearing. The hearing, which was supposed to last 7 days, was officially placed on the court's calendar for October 12th, 2017. The first day of the hearing consisted of testimony from relatives of the victims, all of whom testified that they had almost always believed that Lamont was innocent. Then, during day 2 of the hearing, following the court's lunch break, Cheryl planned to call Judge Burdett to the stand to testify about his romantic relationship with ADA Moorhead. However, she would never get that chance. You see, Mark Dupree had been sitting in that courtroom, listening to witness after witness testify to Lamont's innocence for a day and a half. And when the court broke for lunch, Dupree headed to a restaurant alone across the street from the courthouse. He ordered chicken fingers and fries. However, he only ended up eating 1 chicken finger because anticipation and nervousness had ruined his appetite. You see, Dupree had heard all he needed to. After just a day and a half of testimony, Dupree knew that when he walked back into that courtroom, he was likely going to, quote, tick off the establishment. But quite frankly, he didn't care. He knew that regardless of who he upset, he was about to do something that was way overdue. So rather than eating his lunch that day, Dupree instead wrote up a statement that he planned to read when he got back in the courtroom. A statement that read, quote, I've been presented with information regarding the identification of Mr. McIntyre in 1994 as the killer of Donnell Quinn and Donnie Ewing. Information that I believe was not available during the trial, of a nature that I believe that had it been presented to the jury in the 1994 trial that convicted Mr. McIntyre, it may certainly have caused those jurors to have reasonable doubt as to Mr. McIntyre's guilt. It is because of this information, and only this information, that my office is requesting the court find that manifest injustice exists and that Mr. McIntyre should be granted an opportunity for a new trial. You could hear a pin drop as Dupree finished his statement, and while the entire courtroom waited for the judge to respond. Dupree thought he was nervous. I cannot even begin to imagine the knots that were just crunching up in Cheryl Pilatti's stomach, Jim McCluskey's stomach, and Lamont's stomach. And then finally, after what I assume felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the judge looked out into the courtroom and he agreed with Mark Dupree. He agreed that Lamont had not received a fair first trial, and right then and there, he determined that he deserved a new one. This was a huge win for Lamont and his team. A new trial meant a new chance at proving his innocence, something Lamont had longed for 23 years. However, Lamont would never see a new trial, because as soon as the judge agreed to grant him one, District Attorney Mark Dupree looked back at the judge and stated, quote, Judge, on behalf of the state of Kansas, and as a minister of justice and the chief law enforcement officer of this county, based off of my investigation in this case, this office moves to dismiss this case. The courtroom absolutely exploded with cheers. They thought being granted a new trial was great news, but now Lamont was exonerated. Conviction overturned, charges dropped. He was a free man. Even after decades of fighting for his innocence, that decision still seemed like it came just so suddenly. It is very rare for a prosecutor to decide to reverse a case, to overturn a decision made by their own office. It is not a common occurrence. In fact, it is so rare that Jim McCluskey likened it to something from Mars crashing down to Earth. Lamont had been fighting for this for over half of his life. He was finally a free man. Lamont walked out of prison that same day, October 13th, 2017. He walked out and he walked straight into his mother's arms, uttering just 3 words, "It's nice outside." And if that is not the most goddamn wholesome thing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. It's rivaled only maybe by Rosie saying that her first order of business was to make Lamont a sweet potato pie. Seriously, I want this family to adopt me. They are so freaking cute. Lamont spent his first week out of prison with his family, eating everything he could and enjoying the simple things that came with his freedom, like the ability to make choices and to go where he wanted, when he wanted. And as happy of a point as it seems like we're at in the story, it's still not all sunshine and rainbows. Lamont was exposed to stark and horrific conditions during his 23 years in prison. He was wrongfully stripped away from his family, from his education. He failed to get the life experience adults need to be successful. He's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. He has problems sleeping. He suffers from nightmares. And even during the day, when he is wide awake, he is constantly looking over his shoulder. He's hypervigilant and anxious. And he's not the only one that has suffered tremendously due to his wrongful imprisonment. This nightmare has also had detrimental effects on his mother's life. Rosie experienced bouts of suicidal thoughts. She experienced several mental breakdowns. And even though Lamont is out now, and even after 17 years of intense psychological treatment, she still suffers with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So while it's been absolutely amazing and joyous and incredible for Lamont to be out and for him to have his freedom back, don't mistake for even 1 second that it's been easy. Because although his conviction had been overturned and his charges were dropped, unless Mark Dupree was willing to actually admit wrongdoing by Tara Moorhead, Dexter Burdett, and Roger Galupski, Lamont was free, sure, but he wasn't considered innocent. He was still technically considered a felon, which is absolute bullshit. Like, there are so many things that I don't understand about our legal system, and this is one of them. Lamont was turned out onto the streets following his exoneration with nothing. He had no money, no insurance, no identification. He couldn't even open a bank account when the Innocence Project did help him monetarily. And because he still technically had a felony on his record, finding gainful employment would prove incredibly difficult. And this is why recidivism rates in our country are so high, because we don't rehabilitate people. We only seek to punish them. We punish them and then we turn them loose and expect them to be on the straight and narrow, even though it's way harder for them to do so after. It's harder for them to find a job. It's harder for them to find a place to live. Everything is just harder. We turn them out with not only a massive social stigma, a scarlet letter, if you will, but we also don't equip most of them with any adequate skills necessary for employment. And then we just expect them to not reoffend? Look, I'm not saying that people shouldn't go to prison, obviously. I mean, innocent people like Lamont shouldn't go to prison, but my point... What was my point? Oh, my point is that our prison system, I think, has lost sight of what is important. Instead of trying to reform and rehabilitate people, our country's goal seems to have become to make prison conditions so bad that no one wants to go to prison. But newsflash, people already don't want to go to prison, but simply not wanting to go isn't a deterrent. So they end up in prison, and then they're exposed to, as Lamont put it, stark and horrific conditions that are likely to traumatize inmates, to exacerbate mental health issues, and it's been proven that these conditions actually tend to make people more prone to aggression. And I am sure that I've already ruffled some feathers, but please understand that I'm not saying that I want prison to be awesome. I'm simply saying that if you look at these countries that have a more upscale, rehabilitation-focused prison system, they have less violence within their facilities and their recidivism rates are lower. But here in America, we're basically putting people into pressure cookers and then expecting them not to come out worse than they were before. I don't know. To me, prison reform seems like a no-brainer, but I'm not naive to the fact that I'm part of a minority percentage in that belief. So what are you gonna do? Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but hello, that's my specialty. Anyways, while in prison, Lamont did get the opportunity to earn an associate's degree in business administration, and he also learned how to cut hair, something he actually found that he was quite passionate about. So much so that his goal upon his release was to obtain his barber's license and to open up his own shop, which He did. He currently co-owns a successful barbershop in Kansas City called Off the Top Barbershop. In addition to that, he also co-founded his own innocence project called Miracle of Innocence. He co-founded the organization with a man named Daryl Burton, a fellow wrongful convictee who, just like Lamont, spent just under a quarter of a century incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. So, together the men co-founded Miracle of Innocence with the hope of helping others the same way that people took a chance on and helped free them. Through Miracle of Innocence, Lamont is able to honor his desire to help mentor and advocate for those who need him. Tell me that this man truly does not just sound like such an all-around incredible, generous, kind person. In my opinion, he had every right to walk out of prison cynical and angry. And yet he seriously just comes across as one of the kindest and most mellow people. He is nothing short of inspirational. Following his release, because of Kansas law, Lamont actually wasn't entitled to any compensation initially for his wrongful conviction. None. Nada. Zip, zilch, goose egg, nothing. Absolutely insane. However, in 2018, Kansas did pass the mistaken conviction statute, which entitled a claimant to $65,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment. And it also entitles a claimant to at least $25,000 for each year served on parole or post-release supervision, which sounds great, right? Wrong. You see, Lamont hadn't been declared innocent yet, so he still wasn't entitled to compensation, and thus began his next fight. A fight for a true declaration of innocence so that he could really begin to rebuild his life. All in all, it took over 2 years from the date of his release for the Kansas Attorney General to finally acknowledge Lamont's innocence. Lamont was granted a certificate of innocence in February of 2020, which finally entitled him to compensation. Lamont was wrongfully imprisoned for 23 years, and at $65,000 per year, that added up to just over $1.5 million that Lamont was entitled to from the state of Kansas. He was also granted health care for 2 years, counseling, a college tuition waiver, and his charges were finally expunged. It may have taken 26 years from the time this whole mess started, but the state of Kansas finally, officially acknowledged what was always known to Lamont, to his attorneys, to his family, and to everyone else connected to this case. He was innocent. By the way, that's loosely quoted from Cheryl Pilati. I'm not that eloquent. But a $1.5 million payout is not where Lamont's story ends. No. Because in 2018, he and Rosie actually filed a civil suit against the unified government of Wyandotte County, as well as against Roger Galupski. And this suit was for close to $100 million. The suit was settled just 1 year ago in June of 2022 to the tune of $12.5 million that was awarded to Lamont and his mother. And not that any amount of money could possibly undo what they went through, I do think that it's nice that, at least financially, they'll likely never suffer again. Lamont's been out for close to 6 years at this point. He seems to be doing really well. He seems very spiritual. He's still incredibly close with his mother, and he's living his dream of owning a successful barbershop. And while he does seem happy, via what I can gather from social media, I hope he is. I hope he is living his best life. I hope he is so incredibly happy, and I hope that the rest of his life is just an absolute beautiful walk in the park, because he deserves it. Oh, and I feel like it's important to mention that there is absolutely no bad blood between Nico Quinn and Lamont. Here's a picture of them eating a meal together. Actually, this was Lamont's first meal out of prison, and despite her testimony playing a heavy hand in Lamont's wrongful conviction, he and his team view her as a victim and a hero in this story as well. She tried for years to tell her story. She tried to do the right thing, and she was threatened and intimidated, but time and time again, she still tried to set the record straight until finally someone listened. And lastly, before I wrap things up for today, I do want to pay tribute to the initial victims in today's story. I would have loved to have given them their own full video, to have made them part 1 to this story, Lamont part 2, and then Dick part 3. But there is simply not even close to enough information available out there on these men to do that. But I will tell you what I know. Donnell Quinn, otherwise known as Little Don, was a handsome, charming, and funny young man. According to his family, he could brighten up any room that he walked into, and he was absolutely hilarious. He could have totally grown up to be a comedian. had he gotten the chance. He's also described as a jack of all trades. He was well dressed, he could sing, he could dance, and he could fix anything. Sadly, growing up in an impoverished, high drug area, Little Don was an addict, but at the time of his death, he had been telling his family that he had serious plans to get his life together. But sadly, he would never get that chance. He was just 21 years old when his life was taken brutally in front of some of his closest family. Trauma that will stay with them for their entire lives. He was taken from his family, he was taken from his friends, and saddest of all, he was taken from his son, who was then forced to grow up without a father. He was a kind-hearted person, and despite some of the decisions he made in his life that people may not agree with, he certainly did not deserve to die at 21 years old. My heart goes out to his family, who not only have had to grieve his loss, but his mother Sandra was also a massive advocate for Lamont. She always believed that he was innocent, and it broke her heart to know that another innocent man had also been ripped away from his mother in the wake of this tragedy. And I hope that even though the case isn't technically solved, the man everyone believes to be responsible, Monster, I hope that knowing that he's in prison for 30 plus years for unrelated crimes, well, I hope that brings them at least some peace and closure. And as for Donald Ewing, or Donnie, I genuinely could not find anything other than his obituary online. So all I can tell you is that he is likely mourned and remembered fondly by his mother, his father, and his 5 sisters. And just like Little Don, no matter what he may have gotten himself wrapped up in, I can almost guarantee you that he did not deserve to die the way he did. So I hope he too is resting peacefully, and I hope that his family has been able to find some peace and some closure and some relief in the incarceration of the suspect in his death. Again, even if it is for unrelated crimes. Do not forget to tune in next week when I deep dive into Roger Galupski. He's a piece of shit, and you're not gonna want to miss it. I didn't sell that well, did I? So, as promised, today is a follow-up video, a part 2, if you will, to last week's video. Last week, I discussed the 23-year-long wrongful incarceration of Lamont McIntyre. We covered how he ended up arrested, how he ultimately finally won his freedom back, and how his life has been post-exoneration. It's an incredible and inspirational story, so if you missed that video, I highly suggest going and watching that one before you watch this one. There are definitely going to be crossover and repeat names in this video that you might not understand or recognize if you don't take the time to watch part 1, which, speaking of part 1, I briefly mentioned last week that at the time Lamont was arrested and for years to follow, the Kansas City Police Department was absolutely festering with insidious and deep-rooted corruption. And seemingly right at the very heart of that corruption sat this man, Roger Galupski. What'd I call him last week? A meatball? No, it was a meatloaf with a mustache. Honestly, I stand by it. Anyways, today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the decades of torment that Roger Galupski allegedly forced the Black women of Kansas City to endure for his own disgusting gain. We'll talk about how he got to a place of power, a place where he had the opportunity to abuse these women in this way. We'll talk about what explicitly some of these poor women went through, why it was allowed to go on for so long, and of course, we'll talk about his inevitable and well-deserved downfall. It is an incredibly sad and difficult story, but if you can handle it mentally, I urge you to stick around, because if these poor women had to endure these things that we're going to be talking about today for as long as they did, then the least we can do is hear their story out. So yeah, without further ado, this is the absolutely disgusting story of Roger Galupski. Okay, so before Raj was a wolf in sheep's clothing, building his career off the backs of the Black women he was allegedly abusing, he was seemingly just a normal little boy. Roger Lee Galupski was born in Edwardsville, Kansas on December 26, 1952, to his parents Josephine and Edward Galupski. Roger was the couple's first child, and he was actually their only child for the first 6 years of his life until 1958, when his little brother Randy came along. Josephine and Edward only ended up having the 2 boys, Roger and Randall, whom they went on to raise with devoutly Catholic ideologies and morals. The members of the Galupski family were longtime members of St. Patrick's Catholic Church, And Roger specifically seemed to really resonate with his faith and with the church's teachings, to the point where, for a while, he actually planned to make his faith his life's work. Rather than attending a traditional high school like I believe his brother did, Roger instead attended seminary school at Savior of the World. And while Savior of the World had some aspects of what you would expect from like a traditional schooling experience, classes, clubs, and sports, in most ways it was vastly different from what I assume most of us experienced throughout our mid to late teens. For starters, students of Savior of the World actually lived at the school from Sunday evening to the conclusion of classes on Friday, and then they went home for the weekend. And obviously, it was a seminary school, meaning that its mission was to prepare these students for Catholic priesthood. And considering that it's not admissible to ordain a woman into priesthood, Savior of the World was an all-boys school. It was an all-boys school where the boys lived for 5 days a week, which left a very small amount of time each week for the boys to even see a girl, much less to socialize with one, which I guess objectively makes sense when you consider the whole vow of celibacy thing that goes along with priesthood. Basically what I'm saying is that the boys' days consisted of prayer, other boys, their classes, other boys, their meals, other boys, sports, other boys. And that was just it, on a loop. And hearing that, you may not think that it seems important, but I respectfully disagree, especially when you consider that in the light of the overwhelming number of child sexual abuse cases that have come out of the Catholic Church, many clergy members have spoken out that seminary training offered them virtually nothing to prepare them for this life of celibacy. So when you then consider the fact that Roger didn't go on to become a priest and instead went on to become an alleged sexual predator, I don't know. It makes you wonder if being isolated from girls during these formative and wildly hormonal years, while also not being taught in any capacity how to control his sexual urges, does that maybe explain why he turned into such an alleged monster? Obviously, it would absolutely unequivocally not excuse it, but I guess it's just something to think about. At any rate, I assume that Roger— do you guys care if I call him by his last name for the rest of the video? I don't know why, but it does not feel right calling him by his first name. It feels too casual, like it makes him feel too human. So I assume that Galupski would have finished up his schooling at Savior of the World probably right around 1970, maybe 71, since he had such a late birthday. But either way, he finished up his schooling right smack dab in the middle of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Meaning that from as soon as he turned 18 in late 1970 to 1973, when Nixon announced that the US had signed an agreement with North Vietnam to end the war, Galupski faced the very real possibility that he could be drafted into the military and required to head overseas and fight for his country. And while over those years, Galupski would end up seeing many of his good friends be called into action, his birthday was never called. So strictly by dumb luck, Galupski narrowly avoided becoming one of the 1.9 million guinea pigs drafted and forced to participate in this randomized experiment. I'm not 100% sure what he did throughout this time, in between finishing school and the dissolution of the looming fear of the draft. I do know for a fact that he did not want to go to war, so I assume he was tickled pink with how it all worked out. Regardless, though, at some point throughout those years, Galupski completely changed directions with his life's plan. Despite the fact that he claims to have remained very religious, praying multiple times a day with his rosary, Galupski decided that he ultimately did not want to be a priest, and that instead he wanted to get married and become a police officer, both of which he did in 1975. He married a woman named Donna in December of 75, shortly after he accepted a position with the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. And Kansas City sits in Wyandotte County, which is obviously where Lamont's story last week took place. And as if that story didn't give enough context as to what life was like in Wyandotte County, here's some more. As of the 2020 census, African Americans made up 5.7% of the state's population, with the majority of those Kansans being concentrated in Wyandotte County, where just this year, 2023, racism has been declared a public health crisis, where, as of 2023, household incomes for Black community members is barely over half that of white community members, where, as of 2023, Black adults are more than twice as likely to be living in or near poverty when compared to white adults, where, as of 2023, the life expectancy of Black community members is 22 years less than wealthier white community members that live just a couple of miles away, where, as of 2023, infant and maternal health complications are much more likely to arise in Black community members than they are in white community members, where Black community members have systematically had less access to mortgage and home renovation loans and have instead been relegated to neighborhoods with lower property values. And I'm not naive to the fact that these housing gaps, employment gaps, healthcare gaps, these inequalities run rampant across the whole of the United States. These systems of racial injustice, which all fit under the egregious umbrella of systemic racism, they're not exclusive to Kansas City. They're not exclusive to Wyandotte County or even just to Kansas as a whole. It's a nationwide problem, and frankly, to put it lightly, it's incredibly shameful. That said, I am focusing specifically on statistics from Wyandotte County in order to paint a picture. A picture of, if it's this bad today, imagine what it was like 50 years ago when Galupski clipped his badge on for the first time. Now couple that with not only any potential unconscious biases he may have absorbed throughout his youth, but Galupski has also allegedly admitted to the fact that his parents were racist. So altogether, what we have here is a very likely racist white police officer set to maintain order in a historically impoverished and densely Black community. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that this is going to go very, very badly, very, very quickly. And shocker, it did just that. Galupski was barely on the force for 3 years before he found himself at the center of a homicide by police brutality investigation. Kenneth Borg was just 41 years old when he died in police custody on March 5th, 1978, after being arrested by none other than Roger Galupski. That evening, KCKPD was called out to a local apartment complex to address a noise complaint that had been reported. Evidently, Kenneth and a few of his friends had been drinking earlier that afternoon at a local bar known as the Gaslight Club, and once they'd left the bar, they headed back to one of their apartments where they all continued drinking. Everything was fine. Everyone was hanging out, having a good time, until all of a sudden, Kenneth and James, the guy whose apartment they were in, I guess they got into some kind of argument. They were screaming, they were cussing at each other. Basically, they were acting like two irrational drunk men. Go figure. So in an effort to de-escalate the situation, James' wife called a cab to take everyone else home, but allegedly Kenneth, out of the whole group, he was the only one who refused to go. He continued yelling at James and cursing and apparently stumbling and falling just all over the apartment. James later claimed that he saw Kenneth fall at least 3 times that evening. Once into his TV, once into his coffee table, and then once just directly onto the floor. So with all of that said, I think it's pretty obvious that Kenneth, who would later be determined to have a blood alcohol level of 0.349%, was 3 sheets to the wind. He was definitely still drunk, and supposedly he was acting pretty belligerent still by the time that Galupski and his 2 fellow officers arrived on the scene. The officers would all later testify that not only did Kenneth hurl abusive and profane language at them upon their arrival, but they also claimed to have seen him fall 2 or 3 times in the apartment. And that's 2 or 3 times in addition to the 3 times that I've already outlined for you. And on top of that, they also claim to have seen him fall down a small flight of concrete steps on his way out of the apartment. I guess they ultimately decided it was necessary to detain Kenneth because, according to Galupski's later testimony, Kenneth told police that once they left, he was going back to James' apartment and that there was nothing they could do to stop him. So they escorted him down to the station for alcoholic observation, where I guess they planned to let him sober up in what I've seen referred to as a detoxification cell, which is what I would assume that we all refer to colloquially today as the drunk tank. And from my understanding, this is pretty common. It's pretty routine for people who are taken in for public intoxication to be placed in one of these cells as a way to separate them from other detainees until they're back into a more productive cognitive space. Kenneth was not an exception, and this all should have been pretty standard. However, where things supposedly started to fall apart was in the parking garage of the police station. That is where Galupski claims that Kenneth tried to punch him. And that in and of itself is confusing to me, because if Kenneth had been detained for being drunk and belligerent, wouldn't he have been handcuffed? And if he had been handcuffed, wouldn't it have been damn near impossible for him to swing at anyone? I don't know. Allegedly, Kenneth started getting loud again. He started cussing at Galupski, and then he, quote, took a swing at him in the police garage. And in response, Galupski, quote, struck him with a glancing blow in the chest. And I guess a glancing blow is when you hit something at an angle rather than like head on. And apparently this glancing blow did work to de-escalate Kenneth. Galupski claims that following being clubbed in the chest, Kenneth told him that he had no interest in a fight, that he promised he would keep his wits about him so that they could peacefully make their way inside to booking. Once inside, Kenneth was booked into custody. He was placed into the detoxification cell where he was meant to sober up. However, unfortunately, things would take a dramatic and unexpected turn just a few hours later. It was 8:30 p.m. when Kenneth was discovered unconscious and unresponsive in his holding cell. He was immediately rushed to Bethany Medical Center, where sometime between 9 and 9:30 p.m., he was pronounced dead from what would later be determined to be internal bleeding caused by a tear in his abdomen. Initially, his death was viewed as a homicide, and Galupski was actually suspended with pay, pending the results of a criminal investigation. Ultimately, though, Kenneth's death was ruled as an accident by the Wyandotte County coroner's jury. They determined that Kenneth had died as a result of all of his falls from earlier in the evening, and that he met his death, quote, because of his own self-indulgence. It's worth mentioning that while Galupski was ultimately cleared, he passed a polygraph and he was eventually reinstated, Deputy Coroner Alan Hancock, who presided over the inquest, was later quoted as saying, "As far as I'm concerned, it's a big unknown." Basically, he asserted that what exactly caused Kenneth Borg's death would likely never be known. That in 13 years as a doctor and 10 years as a coroner, he had never seen an injury like Kenneth's, stating, quote, "It's a freak injury. We simply do not know what did him in. It could have been a fist, a billy club, or a bottle. We simply do not know what caused the blow or exactly when it was inflicted. The death could have been a homicide, but I challenge anyone to show me evidence that points towards any one person who did it. There is none." He also made it known that while the coroner's jury had determined the manner of death to be accidental, he himself would have listed the cause as unknown or undetermined. Obviously, it doesn't change the outcome. I just thought it was interesting and worth mentioning. Oh, and another interesting fun fact was that the FBI even looked briefly into Kenneth's death. They looked into it as a potential civil rights violation, but for whatever reason, they ended up not pursuing the case. They didn't pursue the case. Wyandotte County determined they didn't have a case, and as a result, Galupski got his badge back and was turned loose, once again, onto the streets of Kansas City as a figure of authority. He diligently worked his way up the ranks of the KCKPD, all while operating under what he referred to as two separate sets of rules: God's rules and the police department's rules. And while he claims that God has always been a big part of his life, during his time as a police officer, Galupski does admit to frequently putting the department over the Lord, because God suspends you later, but the police department suspends you now. However, in order to kind of offset that, to make sure that he was still honoring his faith even when he was on the clock and even when he was putting the department above God, Galupski said that he made sure to frequently complete what he referred to as good deeds. For example, according to Galupski, while he was on the clock, he couldn't, recommend Bible passages to people he came in contact with, because that would have been inappropriate. But if he gave someone a ride whose car had broken down, that would have been acceptable. That would have been the kind of thing that he would have considered a good deed. You know what he should have tried is not using and abusing the vulnerable Black population of Kansas City for his own sexual, monetary, and professional gain. Allegedly. With that said, as I start to get into the crimes that have brought us together here today, I need to make it clear that as of 2020, Roger Galupski has been accused of victimizing, assaulting, harassing, and abusing over 70 women. And while if I could, I would in a heartbeat give each and every one of these women their own full dedicated video. Truly, it is the least someone could do for them. Regretfully though, because some of these allegations date back almost 40 years, some of these poor women are no longer with us, and because some of these women have chosen to keep their identities private as the case is ongoing, I simply cannot feature each and every one of their stories individually. So what I will do is my absolute best to provide you as much information as I can and as many specific allegations as I could possibly find. Starting with what I believe, based off of what I could find, may be at least one of the first accusations of sexual misconduct that was ever formally brought against Galupski. These accusations came about in the mid-1980s, and they were brought straight to the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department's attention by a woman named Tina Peterson. Tina worked at a local Kansas City shelter for battered women, and on multiple occasions, Tina personally called KCKPD to report allegations of Galupski abusing numerous women at the shelter, which is horrific. I mean, you'll clearly see as the story progresses that allegedly Galupski has a type, and that type is vulnerable. But to seek out women from a battered women's shelter for your own personal satisfaction, like how low of a life form does one have to be? That is disgusting. And what's worse is that absolutely no one did anything about it. And that is a very troubling and very unfortunate theme that we will see replay far too many times throughout this story. I mean, once is bad enough, but the sheer amount of times that someone could have stepped in and stopped this man and didn't, wow. Now, following Tina's accusations, there appears to be a lull, at least in what's recorded against Galupski. Don't get me wrong, I don't for even a second believe that he was on the straight and narrow throughout this time frame. I think it simply boils down to the fact that so much of this stuff didn't come out until much, much later. So by the time a majority of these allegations did surface, I mean, who knows why, but for whatever reason, I'm sure a lot of stories have likely fallen through the cracks over the decades. However, one person's story that has not is Rosie McIntyre's. Yes, you heard that correctly. Rosie McIntyre, Lamont's mother. Evidently, Lamont's arrest, trial, and wrongful conviction was allegedly not the first time that poor Rosie had the misfortune of having to deal with Galupski. I don't have an exact date for when this all took place, but I do know that it was sometime in the latter half of the 1980s that Galupski briefly detained Rosie and her boyfriend at what should have been a routine traffic stop. However, according to Rosie, during this encounter, Galupski threatened to arrest both she and her boyfriend unless she did as he asked. And understandably, Rosie was terrified of being arrested. She was a single mother to 6 children. What was going to happen to them if she was arrested and subsequently unable to work to provide for them? So she agreed to comply with whatever Galupski wanted her to do, first of which was to meet him at the precinct the following evening. So Rosie did as she was told. She went to the KCKPD precinct the next night, and she says as soon as she walked in the building, the vibe was just ominous. She said she felt like every single officer in that station that night knew exactly why she was there. It was almost as if they were waiting for her. They were expecting her to show up. I don't even know if they asked her why she was there before they ushered her into Galupski's office. And it was there, in that office, in a police station, separated by only a door from numerous other police officers, that Galupski allegedly sexually assaulted Rosie. Rosie even claims that as Galupski was assaulting her, one of his fellow officers opened the door, saw what was happening, and then turned around and left without saying anything. And as if that wasn't horrifying and traumatic enough, Galupski then allegedly went on to harass Rosie for weeks. He would call her multiple times a day, and he even started offering to pay her to continue a sexual relationship with him. Ew. He was so relentless and so incessant that to escape his pursuit, Rosie actually ended up packing up she and her kids, moving into a new house, and changing her phone number. Yeah, not only is he an alleged sexual deviant, but he's also apparently a stage 5 clinger. But for a few years after she moved and everything with Galupski had seemed to die down, Rosie thought she was in the clear. She thought she'd escaped him and that she would never have to deal with him again. But as we know all too well from last week's video, there was so much more pain in store for Rosie at the hands of Galupski. It was just a few short years later that Galupski orchestrated the wrongful conviction and subsequent 23-year imprisonment of her son Lamont, something that Rosie feels personally responsible for and something that she has carried almost lifelong guilt over. She has publicly stated that she believes that had she continued to submit to Galupski's sexual demands, that her son never would have ended up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. She is convinced that Galupski intentionally targeted her family that fateful day in April of 1994, convinced that he specifically sought to seek revenge against her for rejecting his advances and for rejecting his offerings of sex for money. Rosie truly believes in her heart that Galupski was determined to get revenge on her and that he was prepared to do so in any way that he possibly could. And the only thing that could hurt a mother more than something happening to her is something happening to one of her children. So with that in mind, are we truly supposed to believe that it's just one big unfortunate coincidence that Galupski went on to take one of Rosie's children from her for close to a quarter of a century? We're supposed to just accept that Lamont's arrest by Galupski and Galupski's connection to Rosie is all just one big coincidence. I don't personally buy that. But if by chance you happen to be thinking right here, right now, that it could have been, let me challenge that thought process with this. Remember the photo lineup we talked about last week? The lineup that ultimately landed Lamont in prison? The photo lineup that Galupski toted around town that contained the photos of 5 young black men whom he believed matched the description of the Hutchings Street shooter? That photo lineup? Well, what if I were to tell you that that lineup made it so that there was over a 50% chance that the photo that was chosen would have not only affected Rosie, but would have deeply devastated her? Would you still think it was a coincidence that someone close to her got misidentified as the shooter that day? You see, as it turns out of the 5 photos in that lineup, 3 of them were photos of close or immediate family members of Rosie's. 2 of the photos were of her sons, and 1 of the photos was of a nephew of hers. And that made it so that there was a 60% chance that someone very, very close to Rosie was going to jail that day. Couple that with the fact that he allegedly coerced false and fabricated testimonies from some of the witnesses, specifically Nico Quinn, who never actually identified Lamont as the shooter. Rather, she'd told Galupski that she couldn't be sure if Lamont had done it or not. But Galupski then went on to fudge his report, claiming that the only reason Nico wouldn't directly identify Lamont was because she was scared to do so. And we know his report was bullshit because he claimed that during their conversation, Nico had placed her head on the table before she'd insinuated that Lamont was the shooter. But that couldn't have been true because that conversation took place in his police cruiser, Sans table. And poor Nico, by the time she tried to recant her identification of Lamont, it was too late. Galupski and ADA Moorhead were hell-bent on getting their conviction, and they were willing to go to despicable lengths to get it, allegedly blackmailing Nico into testifying by threatening her with the loss of her own freedom as well as the loss of her children. And I actually didn't come across this next bit of information until I was researching the Galupski portion of this story, but Nico actually tried to take her own life following her testimony and her courtroom identification of Lamont. She was so racked with guilt because of the position that Galupski had allegedly put her in that she no longer wanted to live. That is absolutely devastating. Thankfully, though, she survived this attempt on her life, and as we know, Lamont was released in 2017. There's no bad blood between he and Nico, and actually, Lamont's wrongful conviction and imprisonment is kind of the only reason that all of this stuff started to come out about Galupski. It wasn't until Rosie and Lamont filed their civil suit against Wyandotte County and Galupski that an investigation into him finally began. Unfortunately, though, we still have a lot to get through, chronologically speaking, before we get to Galupski seeing any potential consequences. But for now, we are back in 1998, which is the year that a victim known only as SK alleges that Galupski first started abusing her. And she was just 13 years old. According to SK, this went on for 4 years. She's accused Galupski of assaulting her in his police cruiser as well as raping her by a river and threatening to dump her body in it if she ever spoke up about what he'd been doing to her. And there is a very good chance that she believed that he was 100% capable of doing just that, because as far back as 1993, Galupski's name has constantly been connected to multiple women who were ultimately found murdered. Women whose cases would never be solved, starting with Rose Calvin. Rose was a 39-year-old woman, down on her luck and struggling to get by, as most of the women were in this story. She was just at a vulnerable place in her life. Nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to be judged. We all experience highs and lows in life, and sadly, Rose just happened to be in the thick of a low period. A low period that, sadly, she would never see through. She would never see through this rough patch and out the other side, because on July 21st, 1993, she was found strangled to death in a vacant lot. And while her family honestly wasn't surprised to have found out that her life had been taken from her, given some of the company that she kept and some of the things that she was known to partake in to get by, her family was always worried that something like this was going to happen. However, what they did find odd was the fact that they were never given permission to see her body. They weren't allowed to see her on the scene where she was found, nor were they permitted to see her in the morgue. At every turn, they were denied access to her and given some half-assed, fragmented story as to why. And these stories were provided by the detective in charge. Gee, I wonder who that could have been. Yes, how'd that get there? Yes, none other than Roger Galupski. And actually, before I get any further into that, let me go ahead and take my break and throw on my lashes. Don't go nowhere. All right, so apparently, even before Rose's death, the Calvins already knew Galupski all too well. According to Rose's little brother Eric, apparently he and other members of his family would see Galupski picking Rose up and dropping her off pretty frequently. And allegedly, she used to tell them all the time how dirty of a cop Galupski was. She would always call him a lousy motherfucker. But in Eric's opinion, he believed that his sister was putting up with Galupski and all of his crap because he was supplying her with drugs. And following her death, the things that Galupski told Rose's family about her death and the state of her body never sat well with them. Initially, he told them that she was already identified, that he didn't need them to come in and identify her. And it kind of sounds like he tried to make them not want to come in and see her. Galupski allegedly told the Calvins that Rose's body was badly decomposed, that she'd been strangled and stabbed multiple times, and that she'd been discovered with something stuck in her lower region, which is horrible, and surely a family wouldn't want to see their loved one in that condition. However, Rose's autopsy said otherwise. Rose Calvin's official cause of death was recorded on her autopsy report as asphyxia through strangulation. Nowhere in the report does it mention stab wounds or any kind of sexual assault. She also couldn't have been that badly decomposed. Her body had started the decomposition process, sure, but Rose had been seen alive like 24 hours prior to her death. So understandably, the Calvins have always felt uneasy about Galupski's story. And given all of the things that have come to light regarding his transgressions over the years, now more than ever, they wonder if not only was he lying back then, but they wonder if he was lying to protect himself or if maybe he was lying to protect a fellow officer. According to activist Khadijah Hardaway, Galupski may have been the head of the stake, so to speak, but he was far from the only problem, stating, quote, "Galupski is the poster child for the police department. He represents many officers, the violated people. There's several detectives that run a thread through some of these cases that have never been investigated." Khadijah, by the way, is an incredible woman who's been spearheading the fight for justice for the Black women of Wyandotte County for years. And she's not the only one calling out not just Galupski, but the entire culture of the KCKPD throughout the decades in question. Former KCKPD Sergeant Timothy Hausbach, who was with the department from 1972 to 1980, recently explained that not only was the problematic behavior of some of the officers throughout that time frame overlooked, but it was just generally accepted. He described the overall environment of the force back then as highly sexualized, claiming that many of the officers abused their power and preyed on vulnerable Black women. Reprehensible. God, it is nauseating that so many people in the department allegedly operated this way and that so many people knew about it and that no one fucking did anything. It took 30 years and a $93 million lawsuit for people to even listen to what happened to these women. When people were reporting these things as they were happening, they were brushed off, ignored, or even threatened. But the second money gets involved, the second that the county is facing bankruptcy for its decades of corruption and racial injustice, that's when they finally decide to listen. It's so predictable, honestly, because it's profit over people. Every single time. I will make sure to have the Justice for Wyandotte Facebook page linked down below in the description box. Khadijah is the director and lead organizer of the page, as well as of the organization itself. I'm also going to link the 7th Street podcast, which is a podcast produced by Nikki Richardson, and she goes so far in depth into the corruption that has run rampant through Kansas City for the past few decades. Sorry, I feel like that was a random place to plug those two things, but it just kind of happened. Anyways, following Rose Calvin's death came the death of a woman named Pearl Barnes, and Pearl was found stabbed to death in a vacant house on November 22nd, 1996. After Pearl came the discovery of Sandra Glover, and Sandra was discovered shot to death in an alley near Quindaro Park in March of 1997. The following year came the death of Monique Allen, and Monique was found beaten to death in January of 1998. And shortly before she was found, it's reported that Monique was seen getting into Galupski's car. Later that same year, in October of 1998, 33-year-old mother of 6, Rhonda Tribune, was found beaten to death on a road at the border of Kansas City, Kansas and Edwardsville. Rhonda was found wearing a dark purple corduroy jacket, a lace top, brown sandals, and orange jeans. Orange jeans that she supposedly borrowed from Nico Quinn. Nico had been good friends with Rhonda for years prior to her death. They ran in similar social circles, they hung out often, and Nico claims that on the day that Rhonda was killed, they'd been hanging out before Rhonda left Nico's house and hopped in a cop car. She got in the car, she left, and she was never seen alive again. In 1999, a woman named Ophelia Williams claims that Galupski assaulted her after he arrested her 2 teenage sons, and she also alleges that he later went on to rape her. That same year, Aisha King and Stacy Wilson were also found together, both killed by multiple gunshots, and coincidentally, Stacy had recently witnessed a double homicide that Galupski was investigating. Both women were in their early 20s when they were killed. And that brings us to Y2K, once again tethering us back to last week with Stacy Quinn's story. According to Nico, whom, as a reminder, is Stacy's sister, and Nico claims that Galupski started targeting Stacy when she was only like 15 or 16 years old. Nico and she and Stacy's other sister, Layla, believe that Stacy first ran into Galupski when she was walking home one day from her part-time job. They claim that Stacy told them that Galupski had pulled her over, picked her up, and then proceeded to rape her. And from that point on, it seemed like Galupski had his hooks in Stacy. Her family claims that she would disappear with Galupski for days at a time before she would then finally return home with cash and dressed in new clothes. And if this really did start when Stacy was in her mid-teens, that would mean that Galupski had known Stacy for a decade by the time 1994 rolled around. And then that begs the question that if he knew her so well, why didn't he make any effort to question her regarding the double homicide that she had clearly witnessed on Hutchings Street on April 15th, 1994? You know, the double homicide that put Lamont McIntyre wrongfully behind bars for 23 years? Yeah. Galupski never interviewed Stacy about it. He didn't tell Tara Moorhead to call her to testify as a witness at Lamont's trial. Christ, the one time he mentioned her in a formal report, he wrote about her as if she was a complete and total stranger to him. Stacy always knew that Lamont was not responsible for the crime he was in prison for. And like her sister Nico, she did try to make attempts to do the right thing. She tried to tell the right people, but she was always dismissed and considered unreliable due to her past and to her struggles, which is just the way that Galupski liked these women. And sadly, she would never see this injustice corrected, because on Sunday, January 16th, 2000, around 1:30 in the morning, 31-year-old Stacy Quinn was gunned down on a dead-end street. She was shot 21 times, with the coroner ultimately finding 2 additional bullets that fell out of her clothing while he was undressing her for her autopsy. Galupski was the first detective on the scene, arriving about an hour after the 20-plus bullets rang out. And again, throughout his conversations with the Quinn family, and again in his official department report, Galupski spoke of Stacy and the Quinn family as a whole, actually, as if they were complete strangers to him, as if he had never once dealt with them. And even though he was fairly young at the time, Stacy's son Jornell remembers just how weird the whole family thought this was. Because at the very least, he knew them from Lamont's trial, but clearly it's alleged that he knew them on a far deeper level than just that. So even at a fairly young age, Jornell remembers thinking that Galupski was shady for acting like Stacy was a stranger when he'd remembered seeing his mother with Galupski just so many times. And although Stacy's case is technically solved and someone is serving time for her murder as we speak, Nico ain't buying it. She does not consider Stacy's case resolved, and she actually wants it reopened and reinvestigated. She simply does not trust the KCKPD. Go figure. Truly, I cannot even begin to imagine how difficult it was for Nico all those years, and for all of the Black women of Wyandotte County, for them to see the things that they allegedly saw and to know the things that they allegedly knew, and then to turn around and watch Galupski just fly up the ranks of the KCKPD, all off the backs of those closest to them. And Galupski didn't just use the Black women of Wyandotte County to fulfill his sexual proclivities, he also used them as confidential informants. Allegedly, Galupski would use these vulnerable women, whom ultimately came to be known as Galupski's girls. He would target them and coerce them via threats or blackmail or intimidation into sexual relationships or into providing false testimonies. He would bribe these women to lie for him so that he could clear his cases quickly in an effort to make himself look like a good cop. Crazy idea. What if he would have just been a good cop? As far-fetched, I know. At any rate, Galupski was promoted to captain within the KCKPD in 2002, all while the Black women of Kansas City feared him, calling him the Grim Reaper. I cannot even begin to imagine how disheartening this must have been. To know that even if they faced their fears and they tried to speak up and tried to blow the whistle on Galupski, that because of their race, their lifestyles, and or their socioeconomic status, they probably wouldn't even be believed. To see more and more of their friends and their family members either be sexually victimized or be murdered and discarded like trash, all while there was nothing they could do about it. Nothing other than watch the bodies continue to pile up and just hope and pray that they weren't next. June of 2000, the same year as Stacy Quinn's death, 34-year-old Vicky Hollenshed Dew was found outside a residence that was known to law enforcement as a drug house. She had been stabbed over 50 times before her carotid artery had been cut, which ultimately caused her death. Then there was Elza Mitchie, who went by Liza. She was just 30 years old when she was found lying on the side of the road in February of 2004. She'd obviously been murdered, having been shot twice in her head. She was known to work the streets in an effort to support herself, and according to Nico Quinn, Galupski was a very, very regular customer of hers. And finally, a woman named Perlina Henderson was found in a park near Quindaro in 2008. She had been murdered by blunt force trauma, and she also was known to work the streets. And even though I said finally, please remember that this list is not even close to complete. Roger Galupski is accused of victimizing, in one way or another, over 70 women in Kansas City during his time as a KCKPD police officer, and unfortunately there is not information readily available on all of them. And again, just for legal purposes, I have to make it clear here that although he was indicted at the end of last year, which we'll get into, Roger Galupski has not been convicted or formally or legally connected to any of these murders, nor has he been convicted of any of the crimes that he has been formally accused or charged with. All of these things that we've discussed so far today are strictly allegations, and regardless of my own personal belief, in the eyes of the law, Roger Galupski is considered innocent until proven guilty. And to clarify, I don't even think that the general consensus is necessarily that Galupski himself killed all these women. It's just incredibly coincidental that all of these women ended up dead, all of their cases went unsolved, and all of them were somehow connected to Galupski. Maybe he orchestrated their deaths, maybe he helped whoever did it get away with them, or maybe he wasn't involved at all and it really is just a big coincidence. I certainly cannot say for sure. At any rate, the information in this video is solely information that I've gathered from multiple public sources on the internet, and anything beyond that is just my own personal speculation and personal unprofessional opinion. As always, I encourage you to do your own research and to form your own opinions. Listen, I don't make a lot of money off YouTube, but I sure as shit don't want Raj coming for the little tiny baby bag I do make, okay? Anyways, Roger Galupski retired from the KCKPD in 2010 at the age of 58. He retired as a well-respected officer, and he was eligible to collect his full taxpayer-funded pension on the way out. Following his departure from the KCKPD, Galupski took a position working with the Edwardsville Police Department, where he remained employed until 2016 when he fully retired. And damn, if he didn't manage to squeak that honorable retirement in under the fucking wire, because it was the very next year, 2017, that Lamont was exonerated. And Lamont's exoneration was kind of the kiss of death for Galupski's reputation. Yeah, so Lamont was exonerated in 2017, and then it was in 2018 that he and Rosie filed their lawsuit against the unified government of Wyandotte County, which also named Galupski. And as a refresher, this lawsuit asserted that several KCKPD officers were responsible for innumerable civil rights violations, and that Galupski in particular had a history of using his badge to extort vulnerable Black women for sexual favors and for coercing them into fabricating testimonies to clear his cases. Galupski was deposed for the McIntyre lawsuit in 2020, during which he asserted his Fifth Amendment right and denied to answer almost 600 different questions. He pled the Fifth to questions such as, did he have a sideline in selling drugs and facilitating prostitution while he was a police detective? Did you ever get charges dismissed in return for sex? Did you ever rape a minor in your cop car? Did you ever threaten to harm a woman if she turned you in? Throughout the 1980s and 90s, did you ever use your network of women on the streets to provide false information to close your cases? Did you fabricate the positive identification of Lamont McIntyre? Each and every time he held up a little piece of paper that said, on the advice of my attorney, I invoke my Fifth Amendment constitutional rights. That's okay, Roger baby, because that silence is deafening. Look, I know that everyone has the right to remain silent. Everyone has the right to not answer questions in an effort to not incriminate yourself. But if you can't assuredly say no to, did you ever rape a minor in your cop car? I mean, it's not a great look. In 2021, as the accusations against Galupski continued mounting at an alarming rate, rumors of a federal grand jury investigation into said allegations finally began circulating. According to Galupski's attorney, Chris Joseph, Roger maintains his innocence, and he looks forward to clearing his name from these decades-old and uncorroborated allegations. Well, Chris, decades old and uncorroborated or not, doesn't change the fact that last year in September of 2022, the FBI indicted and arrested Galupski at his home in Wyandotte County for civil rights violations and for sexual assault. If convicted, these charges could see Galupski in prison for the rest of his life.
Isn't that sad?
Oh, and as if the shit swamp we've waded through up to this point hasn't been enough, 2 months after his original indictment came down, federal prosecutors added claims of conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted kidnapping, aggravated sexual abuse, and attempted aggravated sexual abuse. And these new charges, which involve involuntary servitude, come from allegations made by 2 women who, at the time that this took place, were teenagers. And these 2 girls claim that they were held captive at an apartment complex where they were repeatedly raped by multiple men, one of whom being Roger Galupski. He's accused of raping one of these girls who, at the time, was just 16. Allegedly, Galupski protected the drug dealer that was running this human trafficking operation. He'd turn a blind eye to this guy's nefarious activity. He'd warn him when raids were coming, and apparently he'd also indulge in this man's available services. Yeah, it never stops with this guy. Every time you think, oh, it can't possibly get worse, it does. Like finding out that while he awaits trial, he's allowed to stay at home on house arrest. Even though the federal prosecution argued that he was too dangerous to be let out of jail before his trial, Judge Rachel E. Schwartz disagreed. So yeah, Raj is sitting at home, kicked back, feet up, straight chillin' until his trial. Whenever that may be. That is, if he even makes it to trial, apparently. When asked to comment on this whole situation, one of his ex-wives said that given how old and unhealthy he looks, she wouldn't be surprised if he didn't even make it to his trial. She is genuinely convinced that he's gonna kick the bucket before he sees any consequences for his actions, which, God, I hope not, but evidently he's not in the best health. I think I saw that he has bad kidneys or he's diabetic or, I don't know. I didn't really look into all that super hard. Frankly, I don't care. I care about his health only in the sense that I want him to make it to trial and see at least some prison time. It just sucks that it took so long for anyone to start seriously looking into him. And Lord knows how long it'll actually take to get his case to trial. They've already got like 40,000 pages of evidence against him and counting, so my guess is it's not going to be a quick process. And that is so frustrating, but I guess we are talking about 30 years of allegations, so it's probably unreasonable to expect that the issue would be rectified overnight. As for the KCKPD nowadays, when asked if the investigation and these allegations reflect the department as it exists today, a spokesperson for the department gives her word that it does not. She confidently stated that policing throughout the entire country has changed significantly over the last 29 years, with KCKPD included. Oh, and in light of all the backlash they've received lately, KCKPD has, I believe it was last year, they, quote, assembled a unit of highly motivated and experienced detectives that now make up the department's first police investigative unit dedicated to cold cases. So yeah, I guess everything's just magically fixed now. Don't get me wrong, obviously there are steps being made in the right direction, sure, I don't know if it'll ever be enough. I don't know, you guys, this story is just so awful. Honestly, I'm so glad that next week is my skip week, because when I tell you that looking into this man has probably been one of the deepest, darkest, most disgusting, hard to process rabbit holes I've ever gone down, I mean it. The things that this man is accused of are just so awful, and I am deeply sorry to those who've allegedly suffered at the hands of this horrible, disgusting man. And please know that I only say allegedly to protect myself legally. Personally, I believe each and every one of you. I support you, and I stand with you. And to those who are no longer with us, I am so sorry that you never got to see justice. And I hope you're resting peacefully now, and that somehow, some way, you feel vindication in the fact that these allegations have come to light, and the fact that the scales of justice finally seem to be, hopefully, tipping in your favor. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Honestly, I don't even know what my final thoughts are. I think it's because that there just aren't even words that can adequately capture just how upsetting and just how unfair it is that this kind of injustice and inequality is real life for people of color in this country. It is truly shameful, and if you don't see that and you don't agree with it, you're part of the problem. Hey, me again. Now that we're all refreshed on the abhorrent and egregious things that this monster was accused of, I regret to inform you that this piece of shit killed himself the day his trial was supposed to start. Yeah, oh, what a shock. He knew accountability was closing in on him. He was old, he was in poor health as it was, and so as one last final act of selfishness and of control, he punched his own ticket so that he would never have to face the ramifications of the things that he had done. So not only were these poor women denied justice all these years, forced to watch this sack of crap wield his power and abused the law that he had sworn to uphold. But now he also managed to make sure that they and their families will never see justice. They will never get their day in court. They will never get to confront him. And they will never see the justice that they are so owed be enacted. All because this man was a fucking coward. To prey on women the way that he did for decades while hiding behind a badge, that was proof enough that he was a coward before any of this. But to kill yourself to avoid paying for your crimes, absolutely ridiculous. Now, there was also an ongoing civil suit against the unified government, as well as several other officers, chiefs, and detectives of this precinct. A group of 5 of the victims brought this suit against these entities and these individuals, alleging that while they were completely aware of the abuse that was going on at the hands of Roger Galupski, that they still did nothing to stop it. Accusations which, of course, they deny. There was at one point even a motion to dismiss this lawsuit. However, I, for the life of me, cannot find whatever ended up happening with it. If it was dismissed, if it was settled, if it's still pending. That information, despite me scouring the internet, it escapes me. What I did find in my quest, though, was a donation page run by the founders of Justice for Wyandotte. So Nikki Richardson, Khadijah Hardaway, and Dr. Cheryl Stewart. They've organized this fundraiser in an effort to help support these survivors on their path towards justice and their path towards healing. I know times are tough, but if you have the ability and you would like to donate, I will make sure to have the donation page linked below. It is absolutely a worthy cause. And sadly, beyond that, we are pretty much wrapped for today. You know, not really much of anywhere else to go from here. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week. We will be back to new case coverage again as of next week. For some reason, it felt really heavy on my heart and on my mind recently that I had never updated you all on what ended up happening with this case. At any rate, though, if you turn on your post notifications, you will always be notified when I do post, and you will always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then, though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.